Yeah, I'm not good at icebreakers, you know, and Kathy is like the master. She really should collect all of her icebreakers and publish them somewhere because she's really great at it. Hi, Claire. No, you're not late. You're good. Welcome, everybody. I'm really so glad to see you. We're going to have a nice time this morning, but I, when I thought about this morning, I wanted to just stop and see if we should talk a little bit about how everybody's doing. It's been, and I guess the reason I want to say this is that we're talking about the soul, and we each have kind of an individual soul, but their systems have souls, you know, or sort of have personalities, have like cohesion, and I think this has been a really rough couple of weeks for our collective souls, and just wanted to acknowledge that, I guess, and see how you're hanging in there, how you're doing. And if you don't want to talk about it, I guess we don't have to.
Well, I was going to say I was doing really good until you brought it up.
Oh, all right. All right. Let's just move along then. Good. I just wanted to pause and say, you know, there are just some challenges, and I think part of who we are as people is that we're both singular, you know, like individual, completely unique, and we are communal, and we are connected, and so we're affected on both ends of the spectrum by, you know, being alone or being only who we are, you know, and being, in a sense, as so unique that we can sort of feel a little bit alien. And we're so connected to each other all the time that things that are happening in our circles of belonging can really affect us as well. So just want to acknowledge that. So I'm glad.
I thought of something.
Yeah.
The Kavanaugh thing, the vote hasn't, the official vote is this weekend, right?
Probably today.
Probably right now.
But one parallel that came to my mind was I didn't read To Kill a Mockingbird until I was an adult, and I didn't know how it was going to end. And I kept hoping that all the evidence for the trial, it was like, surely they're going to make the right decision. Surely they're going to make the right decision, and then they didn't. And so that kind of unreasonable optimism is still in me. And so even yesterday with the discouraging pre-vote, I still have this, you know, minuscule grain of optimism that maybe at the last minute someone will make the right decision. And I think it's hard to keep, it's probably good, or you could say it's naive that I have that alive in me, but realizing that this situation of, this isn't the first time that circumstances like this have been in play, and an unreasonable optimism shows up, but then the system goes badly. And I don't know, just the resonance with the civil rights movement has given me some comfort, and like, okay, I have enjoyed a lot of privilege as a white person all of my life, and there are pockets of culture that have dealt with this kind of continued oppression, and just feeling the tension of that this week was real.
Yeah, that's been really forefront in my mind too. Like there are so many of us who are shocked for the first time, like really feeling the weight of injustice for almost the first time. You know, this deep unfairness for the first time. And this, I really like your phrase, unreasonable optimism. Which is different than hope, which is a little deeper and a little more rooted and grounded in something larger than immediate circumstances. And so I think, yeah, I just want to underscore what you just said, that there are people who know how to survive injustice, wrongness, better than we've been taught how to do. Nina?
Yeah, it's, when you said unreasonable optimism, I think of faith, and I think of, and then I think of magical thinking, and I think of trust, and it's like, where is, I feel like I've been in that same place of, what is real, where am I, what am I really holding on to?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I have, it's a running joke between me and Kathy, because Kathy is the hope queen, like, and really has a real boundless well of hopefulness that I think is grounded in the right place. But, you know, after 30 years of working as a psychotherapist, early on realized hope is a little bit dangerous. Not you, Hope, but well, she could be dangerous. Yeah, she could be dangerous.
she is.
Dangerous to certain people, that's for sure. But and so I, you know, I don't. I think I'm always trying to hedge that vulnerability. You know, so protecting myself and helping people like really pull that to the surface, that relationship we have with hope and optimism and that kind of thing. It's sort of it's almost an American trait, you know, this American optimism and can do and, you know, that kind of thing, which is great. Enthusiasm is great, but there's just something really hard about when that gets broken at whatever stage you're at and for whatever reason you're at, you know, you're in that place. So when that gets dashed or hurt or cruelly wrecked, the shock that we take to our system is palpable. And that could be when you're 2 years old. That could be when you're 5. It could be, you know, now when some of us are middle-aged, this same kind of a shock. So I just wanted to bring that out. If anybody else has anything they'd like to say, I just want to welcome you to do that. But we're going to move on. Oh, I'm going to have to...
I just want to say, so I have an uncle in Denver, and I find it incredibly difficult to find anything integrous in what he says, or any for me to see his humanity. It's very, very challenging. And just recently he always writes really long posts, and half of it I didn't pay attention to, but another half he actually talked about one of the things that's sort of concerning him is the divisiveness, and how much we have less accepting, less forgiving, less connection and celebration of values that all of the U.S. everyone in the U.S. can celebrate. And I was able to write to him and just tell him, you know, thank you for noticing the hate and the divisiveness, and for, you know, just that my prayer is that we are able to somehow see each other's humanity. And so it was a neat, just a glimpse into some space that maybe we have a common value.
Yeah, possibility. Yeah.
Possibility.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, if you weren't here last time, I just want to catch you up a little bit. For the last 5 years, we've really been mostly talking about matters of the soul, one way or the other. Kind of what it is, how it works, how you listen, you know, how you just interact with these concepts. And so last spring, after a particularly powerful time together, I decided it's time to write these things down. And so I started to write a book, which still kind of gives me a little jab in the right ear when I say that. And in the process of doing as much writing as I've done, I've realized that I'm not a very good writer in isolation. Like, I lose steam really fast, and I the eyes that I use to evaluate what I'm writing, take on that a too critical lens. And so I it just doesn't take much to let the air out of that balloon, and it's a big project. So long story short, came up with an idea to try to do it in community a little bit. At least not write it in community, but share it in process. Not like as a writers group or a critique group, because there's plenty of spaces for that. How do you write? How did you say that? How did that come off? That kind of thing. But more in the idea of how we're listening for and shaping the ideas of soul, and how we relate to soul, and how it's distinct from other things, and that kind of thing. I realize that relating around those ideas is what really keeps me going, not just in writing, but it keeps me going. This is why I do this. This is why I love School of Life, is because it's a place to talk about things that to me are just extremely important and life-giving. So I decided maybe what I could do with y'all this year is to start reading pieces to you that I've written about this, and to kind of dig in again and start having these life-giving conversations around some of the ideas that are presented here. So that's what will be happening in School of Life. So I want to give you a context of how I see the book shaping up and kind of the structure of it, so you know where we're coming from. Last time, I just started at the beginning, basically the beginning of which is my story, like how I came to think about these things and processes that I've gone through to be in. Sorry about that. To be in touch with my soul and that kind of thing. And then today is like chapter 2 or second piece, which is basically trying to discuss or describe what I mean by the soul and how I see it develop. So some of this is going to be review for everybody. But then from there, what I want to do is take a chapter talking about the characteristics of the soul, like describing them. So next time we'll talk about how the soul is subterranean. And then we'll talk about how the soul is whole. And then we'll talk about how the soul is singular. And we'll talk about how the soul is unconventional or countercultural. I guess I keep using those two words interchangeably. And how the soul is embodied, the soul's relationship with the body, or how the soul and the body are in cahoots is kind of how I like to say it. And then once those basic, that's like here are kind of the aspects, the facets of the soul. And then the second half of the book, I want to talk about what are some of the core competencies that we need in order to listen to, wrestle with, organize our lives around, nourish, and be, informed by our own souls. Like there's several core competencies, such as developing a relationship with the unknown, and being present and listening deeply, and collecting artifacts and yielding power, and some of those things. And then practices to help us develop our core competencies and help us to kind of walk the walk. So I want it to be like a field guide for soul pilgrims. And that's kind of the working concept of title, which, so that's the big overall picture. I do have a plan, which is kind of, astonishing. I'm quite proud of that. What's that, Ted?
I just wanted to say on Phyllis's behalf that writing this book's a real vulnerable thing for her, and she kind of danced around some of the concepts just now, but it doesn't help her if you try to edit her book for her. It helps her if you explore the ideas with her. That's what she needs, is, let's just all talk about this and how it's impacting us. what it means to us and what it's stirring up in us. And not so much, how do you say that better or anything like that. So I just wanted to bring that out because I think Phyllis needs a safe container for this one.
Thank you. So I did have some questions because it's hard sometimes to remember what are we reacting to. So while I'm reading, I just want you to think about how are you relating to the concept of the soul? Like when you think of the word soul, what do you think about? And do you relate to that concept, or does that seem weird or too religious or too something for you? And then how would you describe your relationship with your own soul? Or is that even a weird question? Or like, I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. How can I relate to myself? I'm myself, kind of thing. Which is fine. That can be your response. And then does religion or a faith system or a faith practice help you or hinder you in your relationship with your own soul? And how are you doing with that? And what are the challenges you encounter when you try to relate to your soul?
Do you have any easy questions I can answer?
How do you spell soul?
I'll work on that one while you're talking.
S-O-L-E, yeah. Yeah, sorry, kind of throw you in the deep end. So it's not a test, though. So okay, this is somewhere, chapter 2-ish. What is the soul? I was programmed by my DNA to be a large person. This was evident early in my childhood. Big for her age is what I often heard my mother say. One day when I was about 5 years old, my older brother and his friend were playing with a group of neighborhood kids, mostly preschoolers and toddlers, in the backyard of a neighbor's home. All sorts of roughhousing ensued, all in good fun. Naturally, I wanted to get in on the action, so I threw myself into the fray, whereupon I was gently taken aside and kindly told, "You're too big to play." This intervention could not have been more kind or benign, yet it was a shock to my entire system and seemed to become a sort of emotionally laden imperative that shaped my entrance into the world. Too big. Excluded from normal types of activities. Others I cannot thinking, and something I can't control is wrong with me, became a bedrock belief inside my psyche. Who knew? These beliefs then became magnets for similar learnings throughout my childhood, and I developed a shy, nervously withdrawn, on the outside looking in style of interacting with the world, as a way to protect the child inside who only wanted to play with abandon. The emotional and physiological impact of that moment, the shock of acting naturally and freely without reservation, only to be told that that was somehow inappropriate, has stayed with me to this day. Another example. The first day of kindergarten. I had spent the better part of a year anticipating that day. I was so excited to be in school. The opening scene of my whole school experience found me giddy with excitement, ready to launch into something wonderful. My teacher began introducing us to our classroom, going over the features and the rules that would govern our school day. While pointing out the drinking fountain, she let us know that anytime we needed a drink, we could leave our seats and get one. Suggestible child that I am, I thought a drink from the water fountain sounded like a good idea right then. So I got out of my seat and headed over. "I didn't mean right now," she said kindly. "Please return to your seat." Boom. Same sinking shock to the system. Only this time I learned that I can't always trust what people say, so I must be very careful to inhibit my actions until I'm sure it's safe to get what I need. Neither of these examples is abusive or traumatic. They are, as I mentioned, benign, even necessary. And yet they stand like sentries in my psyche. Millions of moments from my childhood have gone by without sticking in my mind like this. Many moments of real hurt and cruelty occurred during those years, most of which I have forgotten. Yet these two moments remain crystal clear. Why? These events occurred at a time of pivotal development in response to moments of unguarded childlikeness. Joyful exuberance, unguarded freedom, and natural expression become the definition of childhood innocence. If in the face of childhood expression something negative occurs, a child can feel the shock of bewilderment and shame. We call it being blindsided. I certainly felt it in those moments. In my case, the problem was not what was said, or even the embarrassment of being excluded or corrected. In both of those situations, I believed I had permission to be free, and I acted on that permission. In both of those moments, I was shocked to discover that maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe I should not always trust that feeling of freedom, because look what it got me. I learned what children the whole world over eventually learned. Bad things happen if I trust myself. I need to watch out. Children learn by experience. The only thing is we can't be sure what they're actually learning. Their brains are doing the best they can with what they have, but what they have is an undeveloped, egocentric, highly emotional brain. At age 5, a child has no ability to objectively analyze a given situation. They merely absorb the impact of what they see and feel, run it through their self-referenced mind, and lock in some sign of self-reflected meaning. The meaning isn't even in the form of a thought, or it's not even verbal, but it is meaning nevertheless, and the child's sense of self begins to organize around these meanings. They're called core beliefs. Personally, I think it's a bad design to have a child's most important learning occur when they lack the maturity to make accurate interpretations of their experiences. I fail to see the wisdom of it. Every day I think this is a dumb design. Had I been consulted in the matter, I would have come up with a different plan for human development. I'm just saying. At some point, the child begins to protect itself from the probability of unpleasant experiences in the future. Being unguarded and childlike can be dangerous, so the child learns to curtail their natural impulses and behave in a more restricted and socially acceptable way in order to protect their tender emotions from being blindsided in the future. This is the origin of the ego, or constructed self, an elaborate structure designed to cope with the world, process new information, and most of all, protect the soft, gooey center, that unguarded child inside, the part of us I like to call the precious. During childhood, we instinctively move to protect our unguarded, organic, uniquely us self from the cruel and nasty world outside by constructing an alternative self, one that's more presentable, more defended, and less catastrophically exposed. I'm calling that part the ego. Creating an alternative self is a brilliant move because it leverages the risk to the precious. All those little blindsiding shocks to the system, the ego is less affected because it's only acting as a facsimile of the precious. In this way, it can mitigate the shock of exposure, thus protecting the precious self deep inside. So I'll repeat, creating an alternative self, the ego, is a brilliant move. Establishing a strong functioning ego is an essential part of growing up. The ego is meant to be a kind of spokesperson for the soul, since the soul is complex and hard to deal with directly. In the same way that words stand as symbols of meaning, the ego is meant to stand as a shorthand version of the soul of a person. In order to interact with others and to function in efficient ways, the soul needs a condensed facsimile of itself in the world. Brilliant, right? The problem arises when the circumstances of a soul's world create an environment that distorts the ego. If a child does not receive the necessary ingredients for healthy development for whatever reason, the ego suffers, adapts, warps, survives, and presses on, until the ego that emerges becomes increasingly different from the soul it was designed to represent. Think of a plant in need of basic nutrients and sufficient amounts of water and sunshine. Deprived of these essentials, any plant that survives a harsh environment will be a poor representation of its DNA. Maybe its growth is stunted, its stalk twisted. Maybe it never bears the fruit it was designed to bear. The same thing happens to the ego. Too often the ego, which was meant to represent the soul in a more or less accurate way, becomes increasingly estranged from the soul. More often than not, the ego forgets the soul exists at all and becomes deaf to its own voice. The ego becomes dedicated to building itself up according to the values it learned from childhood, driven by traumas and indignities, wounds and disappointments, pushed to preserve itself in a harsh and cutthroat world. This creates the condition expressed so eloquently by Thoreau: the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. Quiet and not so quiet desperation eventually becomes the fuel of the ego, since it is disconnected and therefore devoid of the soul's nourishing substances. The ego, poor thing, ceases to represent the soul, the precious within, and instead trudges on in a kind of paranoid struggle for its own survival. It begins to believe, 1, that ego is all there is, and 2, surviving and winning the game is paramount. The ego forgets its true source, and left to its own resources, instead of the life-giving nourishment of the soul's substances, begins to break down. Desperation, while powerful, is not ultimately a sustainable source of fuel. Meanwhile, back at the precious. One of the functions of the ego is to protect the vulnerable self from the harsh realities of our environment. Brilliantly, we figure out our tender selves are not equipped to face the world, and we piece together adaptive strategies to present something else instead. In this way, the precious tender parts are preserved in their vulnerability. The more threatening the environment, the more distance we can put between our developing ego and the precious. Eventually, for some of us, connection to the precious becomes tenuous at best, and instead of lovingly protecting the precious, we begin to despise it altogether, since it tends to bring us nothing but pain. Protecting our wounds becomes despising our weaknesses, and we spend our ego time distancing ourselves as much as possible from all that potential pain. Poor ego, it gets warped and eventually morphs itself into something that no longer represents its true essence. Instead, it desperately and valiantly dedicates itself to surviving, winning, and building itself up against all odds. All knowledge of the precious disappears or else gets lost and rendered irrelevant. Unfortunately for many of us, this is where the ego and the precious part ways. We begin to hide parts of ourselves from other parts of ourselves. Trauma keeps us suspended in time, caught in painful and terrifying loops of undigested experience. As the ego tries to cope with all kinds of learning, the mind gets overwhelmed with stimuli and works like mad to put it all somewhere until it can be properly integrated into the psyche. It all happens faster than a child's mind can keep up with. Understandably, mistakes are made, adaptations constructed without a blueprint, and the ego races through its own development and does the very best it possibly can. With reasonable circumstances and good enough parenting, I think a child can arrive at adulthood relatively intact, authentic, and robust enough to begin to function positively in the world. I've met people like this, though I must confess, due to my own deficiencies coupled with the work I do with people who have similar deficiencies, I tend to think these healthy, robust, authentic individuals are rarer than they actually are. In any case, I believe human beings are programmed to thrive under the right conditions. Even under the wrong conditions, we often see people thrive in astonishing ways. Without those things, however, many of the rest of us enter into adulthood walking with a psychological limp, governed by fear and shame, hiding from ourselves and our pain. A larger and larger split develops between what is shown to the world and what is kept in hiding. Meanwhile, the ego is compelled to buff up its own image, pursuing symbols of success in order to earn its keep and prove its worth. It has little time for digesting trauma, evaluating emotional experiences, and working to integrate all the parts of us that were put on hold in order to keep up with the pace of living. And the precious? The precious becomes a distant memory, a vulnerable liability, or a long-lost dream. During my time in evangelicalism, I was fascinated by the concept of spirit, the part of us that has been awakened by God, or the part of us that is inhabited by God. I liked this idea because it implies the presence of a little something extra, something larger, better, wiser, more grounded and stronger than myself, living right inside of me. And that idea gave me hope. However, Eventually, I could no longer avoid the realization that I had used my faith as a way to abdicate my own soul work. I talked about some of this in chapter 1. Salvation and devotion, however sincere, had become a smokescreen for the unhealed rift in my own being, a way to jettison anything about myself that was frightening, out of control, confusing, or otherwise nonconformist. All of those aspects of myself I could foist upon the shoulders of Jesus, and he would save me from the terror of my shortcomings. All the positive things I could attribute to his presence inside me, thereby preventing me from having to face the terror of my own brilliance. In short, I used my faith to avoid the terror of being me. Not because I was such a horrible person, but because no one had taught me that it was perfectly acceptable to simply be myself in the world. Who knew it could be so frightening to be a human being? I did, apparently. The concept of spirit gave me permission to experience the presence of something good inside me, free from the terror of owning that goodness as part of me. I could practice listening and attaching to this goodness without interference from the fear of existing. My spirit was simply the place inside where I could hear the voice of God. Not me, God. Not me, God. Once I realized that, though, I was able to dissolve the imaginary wall between my spirit and my soul. I just realized it was an imaginary wall. I'd sort of fooled myself all along. Allowing me to begin the process of owning and occupying the whole of my unique self. Next, I needed a way to think about and articulate that process. I needed a word. The unique self, the authentic self, the true self, the essence, the inner voice, the essential self, the precious. All of these words communicate the same idea. But I wanted something simple, something that communicates uniqueness with a touch of something ineffable, a hint of something divine just in case. I returned then to the word soul. Simple, elegant, human, with a hint of something more. That's what I mean by the word. I understand it's not much of a definition. And let's face it, we like definitions. In writing this, I was tempted to find a definition I really liked and use it for a stake in the ground, just to satisfy our need for a solid starting place. But that would be a mistake. Despite the efforts of thousands of people across the centuries, the soul cannot be pinned down in this way. Dealing with the soul requires a whole different approach to learning, an approach described so eloquently in this quote by John O'Donohue. All through your life, your soul takes care of you. Your soul is alive and awakened, gathering, sheltering, and guiding your ways and your days in the world. In effect, your soul is your secret shelter. Your soul knows the geography of your destiny. Your soul alone has the map of your future. Therefore, you can trust this indirect, oblique side of yourself. If you do, it will take you where you need to go. But more important, it will teach you a kindness of rhythm in your journey. Once the soul awakens, the search begins and you can never go back. From then on, you are inflamed with a special longing that will never again let you linger in the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment. The eternal makes you urgent. You are loath to let compromise or the threat of danger hold you back from striving toward the summit of fulfillment. That's the end of chapter 2. Thank you. I'm going to put this out in the middle so people can hear the so I can actually hear the conversation.
Share that John O'Donohue quote with us.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sometimes I think is the the whole book is going to be translating John O'Donohue and David White, breaking it down, so we can digest it. So I probably need to pull in some other people.
No, they cover it pretty well.
Oh my gosh.
Thoreau
You know.
showed up.
Yeah, Thoreau. Yeah.
There's one quote that came to mind when you were reading that. Nelson Mandela said that there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And I just thought of that when you were connecting the importance of caring for our children and the importance of caring for our soul.
Thank you. Nelson Mandela, also good to quote. Yes.
All right.
So I'm really interested in, what, you don't have to necessarily stick to these questions, but what, Amy.
First thing that comes to mind when I hear the word soul is like the musical reference of, yeah, she sings with soul.
Oh, really?
And I think, what does that mean exactly? And I think of Motown, and I think of, all the oldies. But then there's people, they just, when they sing, you can tell that they're really resonating with either the lyrics or just the feeling of the music. And that's kind of an elusive, ethereal thing as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's related.
I think it is. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think in true to soul fashion, it's more of an art,
Yeah.
an art form.
That reminds me, my son had a concert at school last night. He's in high school, and they had a lot of performances by the most talented of the kids at the school, and some of these kids, this kid, he couldn't have been more than 15, he kind of lumbered up to the microphone all shy, and then he belted out this song with such feeling, and he was kind of acting out what the song was saying, and you could just, he really put his heart and soul into it. And my first reaction was, oh, he's a kid, he's never experienced anything in life, he doesn't even know what he's singing about. But then I thought back to when I was that age, and we start experiencing a lot of life at a very, very young age, and I just wanted to kind of recognize that when we say we're all in this together, it's not just all adults, it's everybody, it's all of humanity.
You bring up something.
Sorry,
I'm
go ahead.
I just related to what you were saying when you were telling the story about your small self. And all of us, there was this audible low, and what you said was true. It wasn't abusive. It wasn't all of us can share terribly dark pieces that also were formational. And yet we felt the weight of that. And to your point, when you say about a teenager, I think we have been collectively given a line of thinking about children that I am undoing in myself as I go back and collect pieces of myself that really metabolize a lot of, wow, that shut me down, or that made me believe a certain thing about myself. When a 15-year-old, we all, as growing up, but we've metabolized this idea that children are not smart about themselves, and they are the most smart because they are the most uninhibited until we as adults and collectively as society who have bought this line that it is us adults that are in this together, and kids have something to learn from our really kid. No, I mean, I cannot, the weight of that. And so when you said they weren't harming and they were even necessary, and I was like, no, they weren't. No, they weren't necessary. We were just doing what we were taught as adults to do, is keep all the kids in line. And it's just so, the layers of that go back. And I think about the things that my mom gave to me, which were stuff her mom gave, on and on. And the weight of that starts so early to pull us away, and I was just struck by that. And then watching my own kids and going back and collecting my own parenting, and it just there's a palpable swallow to that. So I just, and she raised it so well. To be sitting there and subconsciously going, he's just a kid. And then going, holy hell, he's not just a kid. Like
Yeah.
the weight of that is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah, I just, it occurred to me that the soul, the true version of ourselves, is much more exuberant and unedited than what we have to present to society, because it seems like there's not enough room for us to be as big as we are, or as expressive as we are, or as excited as we are, or whatever. I could tell stories similar to Phyllis's where I got squashed as a child. And I've noticed Phyllis and I both have this kind of admiration and instant attraction to people who are really big out there, people who are in a manic, people who are, like on these talent shows where they're just letting their gift belt out there. All these people, Robin Williams comes to mind, he's just a fascinating character, the way he thinks so quickly and is so amusing, and he's just so out there when he's in his manic. And I think if we were our true selves, we'd show up a lot bigger than we are. I think we live in this sort of Norwegian bachelor farmer kind of mentality where Garrison Keillor. He presents these people are so conservative and so shut down and so diminished because their society required it of them. And so I just think that there's something out there for me to kind of go, okay, I know what that little exuberant kid was like. What of that am I going to be willing to express at this point in my life? And what would be appropriate? It's something you start editing yourself all over again. But it opens up a lot of thoughts.
In the Jewish religion, from where I come, in the New Year, in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, one of the prayers, a number of the prayers, talk about inscribing you in the book of life. And when I think of soul, I think that we each come in with our own internal book of life. And when you were reading, and I so loved everything you said, I kept thinking, oh, you've been there all along. This internal book of life. What did you call it? The geography of...
He calls it the soul knows the geography of your destiny.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm referring to. It's been there all along, and then every once in a while there's hints of it, and it's sort of like reintegrating with myself, and that's when I experience wholeness. But I thought of an example or two when you were speaking that was kind of excruciating.
Oh, really?
When I think I was 5, I think I must have been in kindergarten, I didn't like milk. And they would give you a little thing of milk. And I would return it to the milk basket halfway full. And the teacher got up in front of the room one time and said, "Who is returning their milk halfway full?" So do you think I was going to go, me? No, because at 5 years old, I had already learned to be silent. I was already running on shame at 5. And I turned out to be lactose intolerant. It's like, oh, so you did know. Oh, so you were there. And there have been a number of examples like that in my life. I'm dealing with one right now. I have a constant cough and hoarseness and throat clearing, and it's been a million things. And what it is I've acidified my body to the point where my esophagus is so inflamed. So when this election was won, I went off of a way of eating that has been with me for a long, long time, that I just sensed was healthy for me. And I went off and I couldn't put enough chocolate and shit in my mouth. Let me just tell you.
And I acidified my body to the point where it has now made me so sick. But I knew I had that sense all along that I shouldn't be eating that way. And so I think there's something about the reintegration with soul that allows us to read our own internal book of life. And to
I love that.
and to trust that that's our script. And not only to trust it, but to say it. And I think that's where community is really important, because when we say it to one another, we listen.
Yeah, that's awesome. Nina.
A couple of weeks ago, I listened to the Alan Watts podcast every once in a while, and he had this metaphor that I really just have kind of grabbed onto. And he said, you know, we live our lives like we're a headlight, and we're always like this. We never even we're unconscious of the cord and the source of power that gives us light. And when I think about that, I think, for me, that's like, yeah, so the power is, why? If I were to really do that and look at the source, then I just get confused, because God is a mystery. So that's one piece, and I practice Sufism, and one of the quotes that is really I hold on to all the time, which you referenced in your piece about spirit, is God is a hidden treasure that desired to be known. And the idea is that I think of it as, God's a giant mirror, and it's broken, and we are all a piece of that mirror. And our reflection is unique, but it's still a reflection. And when you talked about, that really gave you permission to experience, that was really, I really like that a lot. I think that's a great way to describe it. And then to see that, well, can I actually own that piece? I think that was really where I am anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. But the other thing I wanted to just share is when I was 5, I remember this experience in kindergarten, and something happening, and I have no idea what it was, but I had to sit under the teacher's desk after school.
Wow.
And I have no idea. And so it's interesting to hear, like, you have these vivid memories. All I remember is the shame.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, and the confusion. And I'm sure my ego took over, and like there's something that's driving me based on that, and I have no idea what it is. So it's a different thing. Like you said, you know, some things are imprinted. But yeah, my ego carried the shame forward with that one.
Yeah, it's one of the most potent emotions a human being can feel. So it's going to sort of sear us, shame sort of sears you.
Well, it's interesting you use that word, these experiences that seemed benign, they weren't those things that as adult we would look back and say, oh, that was really traumatic. But yet how it was experienced by each of us certainly was not benign, and that sometimes I look back and I go, well, you know what, I had a pretty, safe and healthy childhood when I think about it from the trauma part, but that idea of what are those memories and what seems benign about them that's really not. It was helpful.
The thing that just really makes me crazy is that it's not like those things shouldn't have happened, or that anyone could prevent them. Like, I don't know really what we would be like if those things hadn't happened to us. Like, they're what shape us. But I want it to be that everybody's fine, all the time.
and that only good things happen. And what's wrong with that? I want to know. You know, I really don't get. Yeah, I am. I just don't get the whole wisdom of humanity very much. You know, like I seriously do think, what were you thinking? Come on, come on. You know, so.
Young wounded parents trying to raise children. Bad idea.
Bad idea. Bad idea.
Man.
So you just gave me kind of an insight, though, because spiritual leaders, I mean, you've given me a bunch of insights that was terrifically written. I really helped shape some things in my head. But what I just saw this unique thought was, one of the things that came to mind, I'd never seen this, I'm not into psychotherapy, right? I love your description of how the ego is protecting the precious. And what I immediately went to is, the ego is creating that common denominator of personality that can get along with society.
Yeah.
And it's knocking off the other edges. And what I just thought of is what spiritual leaders say, we're all the same. And it's the culture that makes us different, whether that culture is Christian-based or Buddhist-based or whatever. And the historicity or whatever you'd call it, the history of that culture, how they grew up. But those are the differences that we all get as a child. In each culture, we get whittled down to a different common denominator. Yeah. But if we all re-expand it again, we're the same. You know?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think that's last time we talked about the necessity of being formed. Do you remember that conversation? There are certain things that form us, and we kind of have to have structure of some sort, like the forms to make a set of concrete stairs. You know, they're these very carefully formed, and because concrete is fluid, and if you just dump it out, it's just going to be this big lump of muck. You know, so there's some way in which we do need to be formed, and we can only be formed by what's around us, and then we somehow need to expand, kind of like you were saying, like. We get whittled down, and then we sort of need to expand again and reconnect.
Well, and I think, in fact, the point is, I think you have to be both. That's part of fitting into society, and as a child, you get whittled down, and you don't recognize you've been whittled down. And I think what you're working on with all of us is the idea that, well, the whittled down thing needs to be an undamaged way to relate to others, and you have to accept it. And at the same time, you have to accept yourself simultaneously, that maybe outside, to realize that society doesn't make you. You're a part of it, but you're something bigger. And so the fact is, I think they kind of simultaneously exist. You know, and that's what you're trying to get to. You're trying to get to where you recognize who you are and your actual needs, and then you willingly say, okay, but I'm willing to conform with society and social settings. And it's trying to live with both of those simultaneously that makes you maybe more healthy.
Yeah, I mean, if we could. If we could. So I think maybe if there was wisdom in it, it would be that. You know, you need some mechanism to just gather and process the data, and just because it's rapid fire, like every single day, a child is learning new, absorbing things, being formed, and can't integrate and can't really stay connected all the time. It's just too fast, too much, too fast. And in a really sort of healthy environment, then there'd be people helping you do that, and helping you stay connected to yourself, and helping you like find words for it. And so you could, and I imagine, not that any of you are not fully healthy people, but when I imagine people who are like genuinely robust, I'm so suspicious of it. You know, I think that there are those souls who really are just, and I'm always like, look at them like, yeah, wow, okay, that's what it's like, you know. Anyway, where was I going with that? So I just think it's a little bit less clunky than I thought it was when I started talking about these things, you know. And I had a lot of like ego versus soul, or true self versus false self kind of thing going on, like very binary and opposed. And so you need to diminish this one and increase this one kind of thing. When really it's more like
the ego we develop is so necessary and valuable, like the front office of a big company that has many things to offer. You kind of need, front office.
But it's not who you are.
But it's not who you are, but it's not who you are either.
Exactly.
And
I'm still processing one of the things that one of my favorite teachers at Naropa taught us, which is that, like, what if everything is happening is it's meant to be that way? Like, she would say that our wounding, our the ways that our ego develops in order to protect the precious, that's what creates our mission in the world, and the very response that our soul is made to give to the world because of that wounding. She's like, we're all going to be wounded. There's no way to prevent your children from having these experiences that are painful and hurtful, even if they're benign. But they form us, and then our mission, our vision, our purpose in the world ends up being the response to that.
yeah, we kind of alchemize. Is that a word? Alchemize it.
Yeah.
We kind of turn it into something that ends up being our offering to the world. And we turn it into something that's maybe better than it would have been had we not had those experiences. Is that kind of the idea?
I wrote a poem about this a long time ago, but I don't remember where it is. But I remember some of my most formative ego experiences were when positive attributes were coming out a little bit, and then they were greatly reaffirmed, but maybe not in the most healthy way. And it was that I was nice, and I was pretty, and I was quiet, and that was celebrated. And so then I thought, okay, I need to be nicer, and I need to be prettier, and I need to be quieter. And it was never negative, but then I found that as I continued to try to find that affirmation that I was receiving, because that made me feel safe, I was losing something. And what I decided to try to do is to redefine that for myself, and to expand the definition of nice, and to live in a kind and gentle way, and for the definition of quiet, to live in a way where I walk softly and my impact isn't harmful but brings life. And then for pretty, rather than me to alter my appearance, but for me to create beauty. And so that was what my poem was about, is how to redefine these manifestations of my ego. I wish I could find it.
That's great.
Well, it really illustrates how we're formed, even by how we're even formed by positive things.
Yeah.
And
And isn't always
it makes me want to bang my head against the wall. Honestly, it does. It's like,
I think maybe I would have been way more badass if people wouldn't have made me be so nice and quiet.
Actually, that was my kindergarten experience, because there was a play area, and I was with my girlfriends in this kitchen, no less, and this boy came in, and I said, "Out of here," and I took up a frying pan. I literally had the teacher, obviously, and had to.
yeah.
I mean, but how she put it was, "Is this how your mother does it with your father?" It wasn't, but it was the shame that comes from that. But it is interesting to see, as we were talking about, things teachers or other important people have done in our lives, and what we take with it and try and that of course made me much quieter, less aggressive.
It's interesting how these early childhood experiences are something that we really have to unearth and deal with. That they are somehow the part of that bedrock of who we are. And our life's work at some point becomes integrating that inner soul or the precious with our ego, and letting go of a lot of the ego and becoming one that can be interacting with the world, not hidden, but now engaged with the world, that part. But yet that childhood piece, that early childhood piece, somehow has to be pulled out of the recesses of our memory and reconciled somehow, because those experiences are just so strong. And I don't personally spend very much time thinking about it. I also tend to think that I had a fairly healthy childhood and supportive environment. But yeah, there were stormy experiences like what you're describing. And it really is important as you're progressing in this guide, the field guide, to allow that time to go back to those experiences, because if they are just kind of glossed over at some point, yeah, there was a painful moment, but okay, that was necessary. Well, then maybe there is more to be discovered there, and more of that true self allowed to be stronger now and ready to interact with the world. And then I was also thinking that as we live in a bigger and more complex society with the school system, and our chances for employment are affected by how we performed as young children and then a little older children, and we build up our resume from, it seems, kindergarten and before. How in smaller societies of centuries ago, people maybe could be their truer selves. The ego didn't have to be as elaborate. And people could become whatever, witch doctors or healers or seers, just very much in connection with their natural inclination, and be these wild people because there was a role for them in the society, and now that role is not so much available unless you really want to be an outlier and you're ready for that. So yeah, I found it very useful and very thought-provoking in many ways, this section.
What came forward? Go ahead.
Cool. Can you? I want to hear more about that. You, at one point, you said something about believing that we're all programmed to be healthy or to thrive.
You mean like?
It was in the part before you started talking about spirit.
Okay. Is it something like, let's see, with reasonable circumstances and good enough parenting, I think a child can arrive at adulthood relatively intact?
Yeah.
It's theoretical.
I've never seen it in nature.
They never show up in our office.
It's like what Elena said. Like, well, I had a pretty healthy, so, but like you said, like these things that we carry that are so informative for us are so benign. Like, so, what? Yeah, that's just.
Well, one really helpful thing that I learned in my practice is that when you're starting to, in the diagnosis process, if you're going to diagnose somebody with a disorder, one of the main things that you have to look at is how much does this particular behavior impair the person's life. So impairment is like a pivotal concept. And so with our own development, you want to look at impairment as well. So if you're out there and you're doing fine, you don't have to go back and dig into your childhood and find your core beliefs and integrate them, unless you're just a dope like some people who would do that no matter what. But if they're impairing you, then, and I think that's kind of part of the movement of the soul toward wholeness, is that the ways that we compensate for these things, they're great for the moment, but they really start to break down over time. And they're driven by a child's mind. So those behaviors don't always fit your current circumstances or who you are now. And so the opportunity for impairment is there, and those are those moments of breakdown where you can kind of go, oh, what's the opportunity for me here? How did I learn? How am I seeing this? It's not fitting, you know. So then you can do that excavation work, you know, in a way that's really, you know, relevant to the situation. So I'm not sure if that's what you were asking.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was just wanting to understand your belief in that it is possible for everyone.
Well, I'm
yeah.
such an idealist. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm just really too ideal about that. Really, I just have this thing in me, like, why can't it all be good? You know, I really love the whole Garden of Eden myth, you know. And damn it, they blew it. You know, that really drove a lot of my. I mean, it really resonates with my my own unreasonable optimism, I guess. Magical thinking, that's really a big deal for me. And so, so that's part of it. And I kind of think, I'm always thinking, what would it have been like?
Yeah.
Well, who would I have been had I really had the you know, the warm nurture that I feel like I'm entitled to. You know? And so I just, I think that it must be theoretically possible. Like, I run into people. I have this really good friend. She just has this robust self-esteem, and I just always kind of look at her sideways, like, how did you get that way? How did you, what's
I want to shop there.
yeah. I one time said, you suck up all the self-esteem in your family. Like, she was just discussing her siblings, and I'm like, well, you got it all. You just hogged it all. Everybody else didn't have any, you know, left in the system or something. I just think it's got to be possible, that there may be, and I really look at how my kids are raising their kids, and like a couple generations down from me, I just really do wonder about more enlightened parents, more present parents, more caring parents. But then you have on the other end, you've got the helicopter parents and the more controlling parents and the more, you know, whatever. So, but I just want to see who these little people, you know, grow up to be.
Because they're going to inherit a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping that more conscious parenting will be a preparation, you know, to sensitize that generation and the ones to follow to what's coming as a result of things that are happening now and before. But I've also wondered in this whole conversation about, is there such a thing as a collective soul? And your question really brought it to mind. I work in a school, and I've noticed over many, many years, I've been there for 28 years, and I've noticed over many years that kids in the younger grades, kindergarten, first and second grade, when they put on their end of year performances, they're all the star of the show. You know, I don't care if I'm singing off key, here I am.
Yeah.
And then there's something that happens around third or fourth grade. And it used to happen to a few kids, and I would make the arrogant assumption that, well, because based on my own experience, they were probably shamed, they're not afraid to show up. I would be a what do you call it, like a backseat psychologist, of which I'm not. But what I'm seeing now, and we've even been discussing this as a faculty, is all the fourth graders are becoming reticent. The fifth graders are becoming even more reticent. And this is an alternative school where, I mean, we let kids be kids. And yet we see this sort of deal, and there are exceptions in either way, but yeah, and it just makes me scratch my head and say, what's going on? And I don't know if there's like a 100th monkey cultural soul phenomenon, or you know what it is, but this is becoming more evident.
Oh, that's interesting. I kind of think there is. I don't know how it works, but I kind of think there is. I've been doing some reading about from like a neuroscience perspective and from a more secular perspective about consciousness and the dynamics of consciousness and the field that gets generated by consciousness that's kind of measurable. So it's observable, not measurable, but it's observable. And there's some early scientific evidence that consciousness does. I mean, if you have a faith, this is no news to you, but there's some evidence that consciousness does survive. It's after death. It is around still, and there's some way it's observable. And so, in a lot of traditions, believe that there is a collective soul, like the soul of humanity past, is still with us in lots of ways, and this gets illustrated by, working with honoring ancestors, or thinking about the saints. That one of my favorite passages is in Hebrews, where it says, "Since we're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses," I just think, if I'm up there, I don't want to be sitting around watching what's going on, but it's comforting to me here, thinking, that we're surrounded and held in some way. And so that's not the same thing that you're talking about, but it's kind of similar. So if we do radiate a presence and a consciousness that is not contained just in our brain or in our in our bodies, then it seems reasonable to me that consciousness can co-react and can create systems, systems of consciousness together. When Nina and I were in the same coaching program together, and one of the things that, and I've mentioned this to you many, many times, that really struck me and really resonated with me that Julio said at the beginning was, we constitute each other in conversation. So, and by that he meant that when we converse, when we interact, we are waking up parts of each other that either weren't there or were just completely concentrated and unknown until we had a conversation, until we connected. And I loved that, because that was such a, I was an extrovert raised as an introvert, basically. And so when I started being more who I am, I realized that in conversations with people or just being around people, stuff would come out of my mouth, and I would be like, there I am. So it was just something that I sort of viscerally experienced. So when he said it, I was like, yeah, that's me. But I think that maybe speaks to your point that there's something about being human in groups, that as we share ourselves, our consciousness together, it is generative. It does create something. And whether that's good or bad or restrictive, or, I think it sort of gets all mushed together and has a life of its own in some ways. So that's the collective soul idea, sort of how I think it maybe happens. I wanted to tell this story too. I don't know why I thought of it when you were, children becoming more and more reticent. Mm-hmm. And Barbara, what you started with about watching this performance. I remember when our kids were in high school, we went to one of those talent shows, and there was this girl who obviously blind, and she was going to sing, and so she came out with her accompanist, and she took the spotlight. In high school is brutal, so, and there had already been these performances that were, they were fine, but they were stylized, they were cool, they were within And she stepped out on stage, and I could tell, and I thought, what a gift that she can't see, because she's not seeing how the other people are dressed and how she's not dressed appropriate. You know, she's not dressed cool. She's wearing kind of a gingham, wholesome dress that is not in style. No, not a stitch of makeup on her face, and she starts to sing, and I just start weeping because she's just there. Like there's no buffer. There's nothing. There's no stage presence. There's nothing artificial. She's just raw and exquisite, and the vulnerability of it just made me, and I just cried through her whole performance. I can't remember what she sang. I think it was, when you take voice lessons, you do show tunes usually, so might have been Porgy and Bess, might have been something like that. But the raw, open soul of her just had me on the floor. And I just had all these mix of thoughts, like, oh, that poor thing, she doesn't know how uncool she is, and oh, that lucky girl, she can't see, and how powerful this very shy and the power of naked vulnerability, I guess, and the just pure unadulterated soul that came through, just was one thing I will never forget. And so I don't know.
I think it really fits that you were impacted, and I think we all get impacted because we all have similar experiences, but you learned real early on, I'm too big to play. I can't trust what people say. They mean more than what they're telling me. I can't just have my own needs matter in the moment. I have to kind of see behind what's being presented and understand what might be expected in spite of what was said. All this intuition has to come online. You just got so many, I'll call some of them lies and some of them ways to interpret the world that show up. And so then when somebody shows up unfiltered, unedited, it connects with that original part of you that was just free, wanted to pile on, wanted to go get that drink of water when it was time to get one, and pay attention to your own needs and just be out there doing you. But that wasn't ever okay. And so what happens instead is you're an edited person. And this reticence you were talking about, Hope, is, I think we all get it, because no matter what, even if it's just, okay, class, everybody needs to be quiet now while I talk, we all learn that, okay, I guess what I am thinking right now or what I want to do right now isn't the important thing. What's happening out here is the important thing. So I got to sort of shut myself down. We've noticed too with, and I won't name who it was, but one of our grandchildren just loved to sing and had words to very complicated songs memorized and was singing them, and then one day he stopped singing. He just stopped singing. And we don't know what happened, but somewhere he got the idea it just wasn't okay, he wasn't doing it well enough or whatever. He's not singing anymore. And he doesn't sing with us when we do, bedtime, and he just doesn't sing. And it's sad, but that's what happens. Somewhere something happens, and we start to edit our lives down and whittle it down, and we become conformists.
It's really, I don't know why, I just put a couple things together when you were talking. I think because of those messages, I desperately didn't want to be me. Like I desperately, it really was a driving force to not exist, to not have to take responsibility for being who I am. So when somebody told me, God would take me in and change my life for His, and I'm like, sign me up, sign me up, then I can just disappear, and I don't have to be that. And so it just created this safety for me to exist and then practice with my own development, my own soul, and not have to own it, until it was time to start to own it. So
So yeah, it was just this great scheme. I never talk to people about this. I just sometimes think I'm kind of a freak. You know, I really didn't think I actually existed, and kind of didn't want to, and it was really terrifying to actually be a person. And some people are like, what? You know, because obviously there are lots of people who don't feel that way in the world, but I certainly did.
Well, and that religious system tells you, die to self.
Yes.
Let go of self. Get self out of everything.
Yeah.
But I really liked the way you sort of dealt with that tension, that it was helpful and unhelpful at the same time.
Right.
It gave you, even though it was maybe a false space, it gave you a space to connect with the soul on some level. And then through that, you were able to work past that and to relate more directly and in a more authentic way. But some of these false systems or unhealthy systems might be what we need at that moment.
People
I
are
don't
just
know.
doing the best they can
Yeah.
to try to figure it out, and try to help
Yeah.
people form.
I just wanted to. I keep hearing safety, and I just am wondering about is the world and our society today more safe for our soul, and our interpretation of what safe would look like. That question just keeps coming up as people are talking.
I wonder if it's really based on externals, because there are cultures in the world where people are horribly abused, and yet they're some of the most soulful, gregarious people. So I wonder about that myself.
That's what when she was saying that, I was thinking the same thing. And I heard someone recently said something that was just said with such great clarity to me, which is, and we all heard it in different forms, but the idea was, you don't control the external influences on you. If you're going to grow up in Syria, you're going to grow up in Syria in warfare. If you're going to grow up, somewhere else, you're going to go. You don't control that necessarily, right? We have pretty minimal control on our external influences. Your whole control and what spiritual wisdom is and growing up is, choose to be irrationally exuberant. Figure it out. And like you're saying, there are plenty of people in awful situations. Their situations are awful, but they don't let it over damage them. They choose to find reasons to sing, to do things with family, whatever. That's where you want to be, where the outside, whatever happens, happens. I don't have to like it. I'm still going to enjoy my life to the extent that I can. That's what you own. Right?
I wanted to comment on the poem concept. I thought it was really amazing, like putting into practice the concept of, making lemonade out of lemons or whatever. And how we all should be at work writing our own essay or poem about our experiences, formulating these thoughts, and then at the next opportunity, we can verbalize them with somebody else, and then they become part of us. They will form even more than we thought inside of us. So like if you wrote this poem today, it would be a different poem. And then that poem will show up eventually, and then you can look at it. But it's really fascinating how if we sit down and process through writing, thinking, and then talking, some of these experiences, we must be just so much more self-aware as a result of that process and experience some growth. I also wanted, though, to ask if you would clarify what you said before, that there is evidence, observable evidence of collective unconscious or some other type, that it is present.
Well, it was just an article I read that I didn't actually stick in my brain for very long. So, I'll try to find that reference.
Okay, thank you.
I'm really interested in this idea of what we do now that we're adults. How do we process those wounds from childhood? And when you had talked about it earlier, I got this image of like this violent sort of dredging up, and that didn't like that doesn't work for me. And
Who
the
wants to go
message
there?
that you talked about earlier seemed like, this like detailed like diary or like writing about it, and so I know that doesn't quite work for me. I've experienced. I have a counselor who's done some like neuro-linguistic programming and some other work, and she has me like in the present we're talking about something, and then it's a belief that we find out it has been in my life, right, since I was wounded as a child, and she has me take like the truth now back to that childhood memory and like reform all of my memories since then. And that's been a wonderful process. Like that has brought me lots of healing. But I'm just wondering if, like, maybe it's another chapter where you talk about what that process is. But I'm curious what that process is and what you have to say about that kind of. Now that we're adults, what do we do with those wounds, or how do we work
The
with them?
practices. I was thinking similar. I don't know if it's a question or observation, but to dredge them up, the inconsequential things, the very consequential things. There is this tendency, comes from certainly my own evangelical background, but I would say lots of communities of faith. There is this tendency, and you raised it as well a bit ago, where we, like, everything happens for our formation. And there's a real, like, freedom to that, to know that it's all redeemable. And then there's this also spiritual bypassing of the book that I just got, and I thought, oh my gosh, that has defined most of my life. Let's just put these spiritual words on it, and we'll skip all the pain, we'll skip all the anger. So how do we go back, retrieve the stuff, pull it out, look at it, and then not like fire off at everybody who, like, I had an interaction with my mom just yesterday, and I'm like, WTH, why are we still at this point, you still parenting me?
And me still responding as a child.
And me still letting you.
Yeah.
Why? So how do we then not, like, how do I respond to anybody in my life with a sense of integration without being like, "Gah," and just going back and historically going, you've been doing this since age whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like, how do
I think I
there's
have a little bit of
dichotomy.
an answer, and maybe this will kind of be the end because we only have a couple minutes. So I used to think that I really did believe this in the 80s when we were oh so cool in recovery and psychotherapy, and when I went to grad school and all that. I said every person needs to find their own stuff and dig it up and do your own excavation work. And I did it. I did it for myself, did it with other people, just very much, let's get this done. And I burned out 3 times professionally, 3 times. Now I'm thinking, my soul knows my soul knows. It knows where the hang-ups are, knows the work that's necessary, knows the work that isn't necessary. So I think it's better, for sure, if you're having breakdowns, then get some help and do the excavation that you need to do. I mean, that's my profession, that's my, whatever. Either that or lots of others. But trust that your soul knows what it's doing, and it's there, and it's inviting you. And sometimes it invites in response to bad things that happen. Sometimes it invites just kind of as a natural way to kind of invite you into wholeness, to move you into wholeness, and keep like leaning you in that direction. And so if I had known this 30 years ago, I would have done my whole work differently, personally and with clients. That it's just a less, we've got to go at it and find these things and unearth them and get them solved so that we can be, not screwed up anymore. That's just a whole different, that's a magician warrior way to do the soul, and the soul's like, whatever. Call me when you're ready. So
know, we just run off trying to do it, when really that's not how the soul moves. So that's really why I'm writing the book, is like, you guys, it's not that hard. Like, it's natural and it's safe and it's, you know, it might be confusing, but oh my gosh, it's just so much better than what we used to do, which is go in there with a backhoe basically. And so
Strip mining.
yeah, strip mining. You know, we have lots of So when it emerges like that, with the background that, what about this is goodness? What about this is inviting? What about this has meaning? What about this thing? You know, then it's just a lot. In a sense, it flows better. It's not easier necessarily, but it's
not violent.
It's not violent. Yeah, it's more organic. It's more. It might be painful as all hell, but yeah.
I have a quick. I'll crystallize it really quickly, but in the process of doing this work individually and in our trusted circles, I think it makes one quicker to recognize when that kind of tectonic plate shifting is happening in another person. And I had a student come see me yesterday, and she just feels guilty that she doesn't want to be a development engineer anymore. She doesn't want to work in developing countries. And I just listened a little bit, and we got to soul stuff really quickly. And there's a you know, a particular engineering, get shit done, check your boxes self that has worked for her, and there's a very undeveloped self that she's in a lot of pain, and there's this chafing that's happening in her life, and she has a boyfriend who's kind of inviting her to be live out of a different part of herself. And so it's soul work. It's this invitation from this friction in her life that isn't working the way it has forever, her whole 21 years. But just recognizing that that's soul work. If I had jumped into like what the down and dirty details of development kind of engineering in a developing country would have missed some really important, deeper issues. And it was so gratifying. It was just a really interesting conversation. And all that other stuff is going to resolve, but it's getting to the source of whatever that tectonic plate shifting is happening. And to frame it as an invitation. And she just said, well, can't I get there faster?
Yeah.
That's the only part. I busted out laughing and snorted. No.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Are you guys okay to stay for a couple more minutes? You need to go. After last time, I wrote a little, and this is really short. Like not an introduction. Maybe it's an introduction. Or a preface or something. So I'll just read it real quick. I don't know why I want to say this. Okay. I know what you're thinking. You don't want to waste your time on another self-help book. I don't blame you. These days, I prefer fiction with very few exceptions. I gave up self-help books a long time ago because I've yet to finish the ones I've started. I have whole cases full of books, most of them half-read. That seems like a waste, although come to think of it, it's not that hard to reduce the self-help book down to its basic ideas, scan the practical tips it offers, and then decide if I want to put into practice what the author is suggesting. Maybe you're thinking of doing the same. If you're reading this, you probably consider yourself soulful in some way. You're attracted to spiritual ideas, but you're a busy soul making your way in the world. I get it. Me? I like to peruse the table of contents to see what I'm in for, see where the author is headed, and if I'm likely to learn something I don't already know. Often I'll randomly open the book and read a few paragraphs just to see if a writer can hold my attention. You're welcome to do that with this one. Maybe you already have. In the meantime, here are some answers to questions you may be asking about this book. What does she mean by soul? Soul is the word I'm using to describe the essence of our true and unique self. Is this a religious book? Because I'm just not into that. It's not a religious book, but it is a bit memoiry, and some of my story takes place in the context of religion. I've moved beyond my faith system, but you don't need to believe in God to have a soul, to listen to it, or to benefit from getting to know it. Neither do you need to be an atheist. You can learn about your soul and interact it inside whatever faith system you adhere to. Is this some kind of mystical hodgepodge woo-woo? Because I'm not really into that either. Nope, no hodgepodge woo-woo here, although I think you'll find the soul to be more than a tad mystical in the way it speaks and moves. You'll be relieved to know I leave the law of attraction, past lives, chakras, spirit guides, and other such phenomena unexplored, however. And what is a field guide anyway? A field guide is a practitioner's handbook, a helpful guide for navigating the terrain of the soul from someone who is actually in the field. The ideas I offer come straight from my own journey. Is this book going to be practical and give me something I can actually use? I believe so, yes. But if you're looking for 7 steps and 3 principles, you're not going to find them. The soul is much too complex for that. Sorry. How much of it do I actually need to read? All of it, of course. Can I just glean a few concepts, gather a few pointers, and be on my way? Probably not, though you're welcome to try. The soul doesn't conform to lists, pointers, tips, or easy answers. What the soul offers is immensely valuable and well worth the time it takes to learn. But if you're looking for something that won't disrupt your carefully constructed life, you're probably in the wrong book. Just close it up and put it back until you're ready. I don't mind. Okay, we're done. Thank you guys.
Phyllis, I think what you are doing with your book is you give people an invitation to journey with you and have their soul speak to them as they recognize, as their soul recognizes itself in that.
Thank you. That's really what I'm really trying to do. Really. I'm so glad you said that, because it's like I don't want to say, here's how every soul is, so learn from my soul. You know, it's more like, here's kind of how it works for me, listen for how it works for you.
And I say that because that's what I experienced in listening to it. I wasn't necessarily hearing the same things that you saw, but stuff would come up for me that, oh, that's my soul speaking to me, but it's not the same thing or the same way that you're describing, but there's something coming forward.
Good.
And you're holding space for that is what it feels like.
Oh, good. Thank you. That's really